Welcome to Lovescape, where power, betrayal, and silence tell the loudest stories. The narrator begins, a voice calm yet commanding, promising a story of quiet loyalty, unseen influence, and the invisible currency that money cannot buy. The room smelled faintly of old leather, polished mahogany, and the subtle trace of my billionaire grandfather's expensive cologne, a scent that lingered like a warning, reminding everyone present that wealth was never just numbers, it was control, observation, and the quiet judgment of human behavior. A long table stretched across the room, lined with crystal water glasses that sat untouched, reflecting the anxious faces around them, each family member sitting straighter than usual, adjusting posture as if good posture alone could secure the fortune they were about to inherit. Eyes darted toward the lawyer at the head of the table, a man whose calm voice carried decades of experience handling the estates of the extremely wealthy, and whose words would now determine the direction of lives, relationships, and egos. The room was filled with subtle tension, the kind that makes your chest tighten and your stomach twist, a quiet pressure that weighs on everyone equally, whether they show it or not. Pattern interrupt, pause for a moment and ask yourself, if you were sitting in that room, surrounded by greed, envy, and anticipation, would your heartbeat accelerate with excitement, or tighten with fear? That very hesitation is exactly what makes stories of inheritance so magnetic, and what makes power quietly devastating when wielded correctly. The lawyer cleared his throat, and suddenly the murmurs in the room stopped. His voice was deliberate, almost ceremonial, each word dropping like a stone into the heavy silence. To my eldest son, $20 million. Polite gasps rippled through the room. Faces lit up with relief, pride, and quiet scheming. To my daughter, $15 million. More gasps, small smiles, whispers, and almost imperceptible nods between cousins calculating how far this money could take them. Some muttered jokes to ease the tension, I guess we'll need bigger wallets, but even the humor felt shallow against the gravity of the moment. You could feel the energy in the room shift with each name, like a tide moving slowly but inexorably toward a hidden cliff. Subtle smiles, quiet handshakes, crossed legs tapping nervously against polished floors. And yet, despite the excitement surrounding me, I sat silently, a mixture of calm and anticipation building in my chest, because I had always known my grandfather's ways. He had never been a man who handed out lessons openly. He watched quietly, noting who arrived when there was nothing to gain, who stayed when the room was empty, who listened when no one else would. I remembered the evenings I had spent by his side, preparing his meals when no one else noticed the simplest acts of service, the countless stories I had listened to without complaint even though they repeated endlessly, the moments where I stayed when others left, distracted by their own lives. Those small, unseen moments were never ignored. In fact, they were precisely what mattered most. Money can buy attention, influence, even power, but it cannot buy loyalty, patience, or presence. And my grandfather had been observing all of it for decades. As the lawyer continued, names and numbers were read aloud, each one met with quiet applause, nods, or murmurs of approval. Cousins calculated in their minds, aunts and uncles whispered, sometimes smirking, sometimes shaking their heads at the perceived generosity. My uncles leaned back in their chairs, arms crossed, smiles stretching as though inheritance alone could declare supremacy. Some even glanced sideways at me, likely expecting disappointment, thinking I had been overlooked or dismissed. Pattern interrupt, ask yourself this, if you were the one everyone assumed would get nothing, would you sit quietly and let them make the mistake of underestimating you, or would you react? That tiny thought alone is enough to shift the dynamic in any room. By the time the lawyer was halfway through the list, a subtle nervous energy had settled over the table. People shifted in their seats, smoothed their hair, whispered jokes, and tapped fingers, all trying to mask impatience and anticipation. My cousins leaned forward, calculating which investments they could make immediately, while some of the older relatives muttered under their breath about tax planning and future inheritances. It was fascinating to watch, the way money can so easily reveal character, or expose the lack of it. But I stayed quiet, knowing that my grandfather's intentions had never been about the visible wealth. Those who had spent their lives chasing recognition, attention, or convenience would learn the hard way that there were rewards far beyond cash. The real inheritance, I knew, was hidden. And then it happened. Silence fell over the room like a heavy curtain. Absolute, suffocating silence that made my own heartbeat echo in my ears. Every pair of eyes, previously flicking with calculation or excitement, now turned toward the lawyer. Every whisper stopped mid-word. Even the air felt charged, as if it were aware that a pivotal moment had arrived. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and leaned forward, his gaze locking directly on me. A small shift occurred in the room, the kind that makes you realize that attention alone can feel like pressure, like the weight of expectation pressing on your shoulders, but also like the moment before a storm breaks. Everyone around me had been distracted by money, yet here I was, the one person who had quietly observed, patiently served, and stayed loyal without reward. I could see it in their faces. Curiosity, envy, disbelief, anticipation. Some smiled nervously. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The cousins whispered under their breath. "What's going to happen?" one muttered. My uncles leaned forward, incredulous. "Pattern interrupt, let me ask you, if you were in this position, having quietly earned attention while everyone else flaunted entitlement, how would you react when the moment of truth arrives?" That thought alone makes hearts pound. And then I realized something fundamental. My grandfather's empire, like his lessons, had always been about observation, subtle influence, and the reward of patience. Those who chased glory and immediate recognition had only trained themselves for disappointment. The air thickened as the lawyer continued, carefully placing each word like a delicate puzzle piece. Every gesture, every pause, amplified the tension, and yet my mind remained calm, a quiet contrast to the chaos unfolding around me. I thought about the nights I had stayed by my grandfather's side while others left. I remembered the countless conversations no one else heard, the times I had anticipated his needs without asking, the patience and empathy that no one else noticed. Those invisible acts had not gone unnoticed by him, and in that moment, I realized the real purpose of this will. It wasn't just about dividing money. It was a test, a stage, a demonstration of who had truly earned influence, who had seen the value of patience, and who would ultimately be empowered in ways no one else could predict. And just as my name was about to be called, the first real cliffhanger struck, the room collectively held its breath, a tense silence that made even the polished wood and crystal glasses feel heavy. People leaned forward, shifted in their chairs, whispered under their breath, and tried to predict what was coming. No one noticed me smiling faintly, because I knew what my grandfather had been preparing all along. Money can be inherited, but influence, control, and subtle power are earned. The family's eyes were all fixed on the lawyer, and yet they didn't realize that the most powerful position in the room wasn't being read aloud yet. At that moment, I could almost hear the unspoken thoughts circling the room. Did they overlook me? Did they misjudge me? What could possibly be so significant that it isn't money? And that, right there, is the secret. Because while everyone else counted their winnings, the real inheritance, the thing no one could see coming, was about to change everything. And as the lawyer prepared to speak my name, the tension reached its peak, leaving the audience, the family, and myself on the edge of revelation. The first part of this story ends here, with the ultimate cliffhanger, because the inheritance I was about to receive would not be in cash, but in something far more powerful, and far more dangerous. The room remained frozen in suspense as the lawyer finally spoke my name. Every eye turned toward me, every whispered calculation stopped mid-thought, and even the faint ticking of the grandfather clock on the wall seemed to pause. "To my grandchild," he said slowly, deliberately, "I leave not money, but responsibility." The words hung in the air, heavy and strange, like a puzzle everyone could sense but none could solve immediately. A few of my cousins laughed nervously, assuming this was some kind of joke, while others muttered under their breath, "Figures, they get nothing as usual." Pattern interrupt. Let me ask you, if everyone around you had already received millions, and you were suddenly given responsibility instead, how would you feel? Confused, frustrated, or quietly triumphant? That question alone is enough to make a person squirm. I kept my face calm, letting them underestimate me, because my grandfather had taught me long ago that power doesn't announce itself loudly. It moves silently, invisibly, and at the right moment, it strikes in ways no one can anticipate. As murmurs spread across the room, I noticed the subtle shifts in posture, the way the smiles on some faces faltered, how eyes darted sideways as if suddenly unsure of the meaning behind the words. The lawyer continued, "All family trusts, investments, and holdings will be managed under a structure I designed, with one final authority." He paused, letting the weight of the statement sink in. The room leaned forward collectively, everyone now realizing that inheritance was not what they had expected. My uncles exchanged nervous glances. My cousins whispered, "What does that even mean?" The aunts murmured, "They can't control it all." And yet, the lawyer's eyes moved to me again, calm, precise, like a silent judge acknowledging a long-expected outcome. This was the moment everyone started to understand that my grandfather had not simply divided wealth, he had engineered a system that placed me in a position of invisible power, the kind that cannot be bought or challenged without careful strategy. Humor pattern interrupt. One cousin whispered, "Great, they got nothing, and now they have to ask them for approval." The room chuckled nervously, but the joke barely hid the growing tension. I thought back to all the years of quiet service, of patient observation, of showing up when others left. Every night I spent tending to my grandfather, bringing him meals, listening to endless stories, watching the way he tested everyone around him without a word, had been noticed. Loyalty, presence, and patience were my inheritance, not dollars. And now, as the room finally began to process this, a subtle panic spread. My family had spent decades thinking wealth alone was power, but suddenly they realized control, the invisible kind, was being wielded by the one they had ignored. The lawyer continued, outlining how all transactions would require oversight and approval, how decisions that seemed automatic would now pass through my hands. Every family member who had mocked me, ignored me, or dismissed me was suddenly in a position where their money, their plans, even their sense of control, depended on me. The energy in the room shifted dramatically. The smiles faded first, replaced by confusion. The subtle tapping of fingers stopped. Eyes widened as reality set in. Millions could be theirs, but only if I allowed it, only if I approved. I could feel the subtle fear in the room, the way people who had previously exuded confidence now glanced nervously, unsure of what came next. Pattern interrupt. Ask yourself, if you suddenly held the invisible leash over people who thought they outranked you, what would you do? Would you act immediately, or wait? I decided to wait. Patience, after all, was my grandfather's greatest lesson. He had taught me that revenge and power are rarely loud, they are quiet, deliberate, and striking precisely at the right moment. And so I sat, watching faces tighten with tension, listening to whispers of disbelief, and letting them stew in the uncertainty I now controlled. The cousins who had calculated how far their millions would go suddenly realized that those calculations meant nothing without my consent. The uncles who had leaned back smugly now shifted nervously. Even the aunts, who had quietly assumed everything was theirs by birthright, now glanced at me with a mixture of curiosity, fear, and subtle resentment. Here's another pattern interrupt for you. Have you ever seen someone underestimate you for years, only to realize too late that you had quietly been preparing for this exact moment? That is exactly what was happening in this room. I smiled faintly, not out of arrogance, but out of calm recognition. Every single family member was learning the hard way that influence, patience, and observation are more powerful than money alone. And they were learning it slowly, painfully, as the lawyer's voice outlined the extent of the responsibilities I now held. Hours could have passed in that room, though probably only a few minutes went by. The tension was almost unbearable. The lawyer's monotone delivery could not hide the silent drama, the way people's egos shifted, how whispers circulated like invisible ripples of panic. The question remained, what could I do with this invisible power? And that, my audience, is exactly where the story becomes even more compelling. Because the true inheritance is not always immediately visible, it is the ability to influence outcomes, to hold the keys to opportunity, and to wield quiet authority that those around you can see but cannot touch. I remembered the many times my grandfather had tested me without speaking. The evenings I brought him meals no one else thought to prepare, the nights I stayed awake listening to stories repeated endlessly, the small acts of kindness that went unnoticed by anyone except him, all of those years had built to this moment. And now, my family, who had assumed I was powerless, suddenly faced a reality they could not change. The inheritance they had laughed about, calculated about, and planned for depended entirely on someone they had ignored for years. The room's energy shifted subtly but unmistakably, the once confident and entitled faces now carried uncertainty, a touch of fear, and begrudging respect. The lawyer finally paused, looking at me one last time before closing the will. The room remained silent. Everyone processed what had just happened, each in their own way. Some leaned back, defeated, realizing that their wealth was only valuable if I allowed it to flow. Others whispered, trying to plot, trying to regain control. And yet I remained calm, quietly enjoying the unfolding tension, fully aware that the most powerful moves are often invisible, patient, and deliberate. My grandfather's lesson was now clear: patience, loyalty, and presence outweigh greed, impatience, and entitlement. And I had inherited them all, unseen by the world, quietly holding power over millions. As I looked around, I realized that the room had changed. The subtle dynamics shifted. The family who had laughed, who had judged, who had underestimated me, were now playing a game they did not understand. And that, my audience, is where part 2 must end, leaving you hanging at the moment when invisible power becomes undeniable, when patience becomes dominance, and when the quiet one in the room is suddenly the most dangerous. What would I do with this power? How would I wield it? And how far would my family go to try and reclaim what they assumed was theirs? These questions will be answered in part 3, but for now, the tension remains thick, the suspense unbearable, and the lesson clear: the most valuable inheritance is never measured in money. The lawyer finally paused, looking at me one last time before closing the will. The room remained silent. Everyone processed what had just happened, each in their own way. Some leaned back, defeated, realizing that their wealth was only valuable if I allowed it to flow. Others whispered, trying to plot, trying to regain control. And yet I remained calm, quietly enjoying the unfolding tension, fully aware that the most powerful moves are often invisible, patient, and deliberate. My grandfather's lesson was now clear: patience, loyalty, and presence outweigh greed, impatience, and entitlement. And I had inherited them all, unseen by the world, quietly holding power over millions. As I looked around, I realized that the room had changed. The subtle dynamics shifted. The family who had laughed, who had judged, who had underestimated me, were now playing a game they did not understand. And that, my audience, is where part 2 must end, leaving you hanging at the moment when invisible power becomes undeniable, when patience becomes dominance, and when the quiet one in the room is suddenly the most dangerous. What would I do with this power? How would I wield it? And how far would my family go to try and reclaim what they assumed was theirs? These questions will be answered in part 3, but for now, the tension remains thick, the suspense unbearable, and the lesson clear: the most valuable inheritance is never measured in money. The tension in the room had reached a point where even the air seemed heavy, pressing down on every shoulder, every nervous glance, every subtle twitch. My cousins shifted in their seats, trying to mask frustration with forced smiles. My uncles leaned forward, eyes narrowing, trying to calculate what this responsibility inheritance could possibly mean. Even the aunts, who had smiled smugly at the beginning, now glanced at me with a mix of curiosity, fear, and subtle irritation. And I sat quietly, calm and measured, because I knew something they didn't. The real power my grandfather had left me was invisible, untouchable, and far more dangerous than money. Pattern interrupt, ask yourself, what would you do if the wealth you'd been chasing for years suddenly depended on someone you had ignored for decades? That exact question hung over every person in that room, unanswered, yet unavoidable. The lawyer cleared his throat, finally ready to reveal the details, and everyone leaned in instinctively. He spoke slowly, carefully, emphasizing every word. The grandchild I have named holds full authority over the release of funds, investments, and all financial decisions relating to the trusts outlined in this will. While everyone else receives the benefit of my fortune, the timing, access, and approval of all distributions lies with them. There was a pause as the words sank in. Some eyebrows rose. A cousin whispered under their breath, "Wait, what?" My uncle's jaws tightened. The room had shifted from confident smugness to quiet unease. Even the cousin who had joked about needing bigger wallets fell silent, realizing for the first time that their millions weren't entirely theirs to control. And then the lawyer added, "Decisions are to be executed with consideration, patience, and adherence to my grandfather's intentions, and final discretion rests with the named grandchild." That's when the truth became undeniable. My grandfather had engineered a system where I held invisible power, control over decisions, and influence over millions of dollars that everyone had assumed belonged to them automatically. The room's energy shifted palpably, like a storm slowly gathering over calm waters. I could feel their envy, confusion, and unspoken panic, and I smiled quietly, letting them stew. Pattern interrupt, here's a question. Have you ever been underestimated for years, only to suddenly realize you hold all the keys? How would that feel? The cousins looked at one another nervously. Whispers escalated. A subtle tension, almost like fear, rippled through the room. One uncle tried to mask his unease with a forced laugh. "So, they're in charge of everything?" he asked, his voice barely steady. The lawyer nodded solemnly, letting the weight of his words sink in further. I could almost hear the unspoken calculations racing through their minds. Every plan, every assumption, every sense of entitlement they had built over decades suddenly had a caveat: their wealth depended on me. And that, my audience, is when the true inheritance revealed itself, not in money, but in the quiet dominance that comes from control and observation. I remembered my grandfather's lessons from long ago. Power doesn't announce itself. Revenge doesn't roar, it creeps. The quietest, most patient person in the room often holds the most influence. And in that moment, I understood the genius of what he had done. While everyone else had focused on immediate gain, my grandfather had prepared me for the long game, the ultimate payoff for loyalty and patience. The inheritance they assumed they understood was meaningless without acknowledgement of that subtle authority. And now, it was my turn to decide how this power would be exercised. I didn't immediately act. I didn't shout, I didn't scold, I didn't display triumph. I waited, letting every cousin, uncle, and aunt squirm in silent frustration. Their minds raced, trying to anticipate my next move. Some muttered, "They can't do this," others whispered quietly, trying to plot ways around the invisible control I now held. And yet, nothing could bypass the careful structure my grandfather had designed. Every distribution, every decision, every step they took to access their inheritance would pass through my hands, quietly, invisibly, strategically. Pattern interrupt, ask yourself again, if you were in that position, quietly holding the power no one sees, what would your first move be? Immediate revenge? Patience? Or subtle control that will haunt them long-term? Days passed after the will reading, though it felt like weeks in the charged atmosphere of family dynamics. Every phone call, every meeting, every conversation about investments now came with a subtle tension. My cousins approached me politely, masks of civility hiding quiet panic. My uncles asked questions with hidden desperation. Even the aunts, who had always assumed life gave them automatic privileges, now deferred to me. The lesson was clear: invisible power is often more terrifying than visible wealth. Everyone realized, slowly, painfully, that I controlled the rhythm, timing, and flow of their millions without lifting a hand unnecessarily. My grandfather had handed me the ultimate weapon: influence that cannot be challenged directly, patience that cannot be rushed, and authority that cannot be ignored. I thought back to all the moments that had prepared me for this, the nights I stayed to help him, the small acts of care no one noticed, the loyalty I offered when no one else bothered. And I realized the brilliance of his design. While everyone else had focused on immediate reward, I had been quietly building the foundation of power that no one could see. Pattern interrupt, let me ask you, if you had the ability to control wealth and decisions without anyone realizing, how would you play it? That question alone is enough to hold anyone in suspense. Weeks turned into months. Subtle patterns emerged. Cousins began waiting for approval before making moves. Uncles consulted me, often reluctantly. The subtle panic in aunts' eyes became almost palpable when they realized that the real authority in the family was not wealth, but the one who could decide when and how it would be distributed. And all the while, I remained calm, patient, observing, letting the silent power ripple through the family dynamics. It was almost poetic. Those who had mocked, dismissed, and underestimated me were now quietly bound by my discretion. Their frustration, their envy, their subtle fear became a testament to the quiet genius of my grandfather's final design. And then came the final, most satisfying realization: the inheritance my family had assumed was about money alone was, in truth, about influence, observation, and subtle dominance. Every action they took now passed through my hands. Every assumption they had made about their supremacy was being quietly dismantled, not with loud words, but with the invisible authority I now held. Pattern interrupt, ask yourself one last time: is it more powerful to have money in hand, or control over the people who have it? By now, I think you know the answer. As the story closes, I want to leave you with this: my grandfather's lessons were never about wealth alone, they were about character, patience, and the invisible power of quiet influence. While my family obsessed over immediate reward, I inherited the thing that no one could see but everyone would feel: authority, timing, and the subtle satisfaction of knowing that patience, loyalty, and presence always carry more weight than greed, impatience, and entitlement. This is the lesson of Lovescape. Sometimes the quietest person in the room holds the greatest power, and the inheritance you least expect is often the one that changes everything. And for those of you wondering how patience and timing can create life-changing outcomes beyond just family dramas, click the next video on your screen to discover the power of compounding, not just in money, but in life, discipline, and influence. Because what my grandfather left me wasn't just control, it was the ability to shape the future in ways others could never imagine.